Best Radio is online radio is either pre-recorded MP3 files or live via a microphone broadcast that are streamed over the internet. With Afrik Best Radio, we are not limited to one geographic area or dependent upon syndication partners picking up your show in order for it to be heard. It can be heard all over the world, global. The best and easiest way to listen to Afrik Best Radio on your phone in your car is via the appropriate app, Afrik Best Radio, official apps. Our website at www.afrikbestradio.online. Our partners that offer apps include Afrik Best Radio on Pandora, Afrik Best Radio on Last.fm, Afrik Best Radio on iHeartRadio, Afrik Best Radio on LiveX Live, Afrik Best Radio on TuneIn Radio, and many more. Just type Afrik Best Radio on any browser or search engine online. How do we promote your business? Afrik Best Radio advertising can help you to get so many listeners while they are busy in their daily work on can easily promote business or brand. They gives you voice to your brand. Others provide readers and experience that can truly define your brand and business. Afrik Best Radio advertising is different. It gives your brand a voice and reminds listeners about your product or service. Those who hear your ad can build a mental image of your brand.
Storytelling. We've been gone for a few months, but now we're back, and once again we are brought to you by Afrik Best Radio, the best radio station in the world. We are back, and once again we will be talking about stories, storytelling, and the nature of stories. And to begin with, let's look at some old stories. In particular, today on storytelling, let us look at some fairy tales. Once again, we are brought to you by Afrik Best Radio, and we will be right back after the break.
Afrik Best Radio is online radio is either pre-recorded MP3 files or live via a microphone broadcast that are streamed over the internet. With Afrik Best Radio, we are not limited to one geographic area or dependent upon syndication partners picking up your show in order for it to be heard. It can be heard all over the world, global. The best and easiest way to listen to Afrik Best Radio on your phone in your car is via the appropriate app, Afrik Best Radio, official apps. Our website at www.afrikbestradio.online. Our partners that offer apps include Afrik Best Radio on Pandora, Afrik Best Radio on Last.fm, Afrik Best Radio on iHeart.
So, welcome back to the program once again. We are storytelling, and today we will be talking about fairy tales. In particular, we will be reviewing an edition of the Grimm's fairy tales. These are a collection of fairy tales that were collected and written down and published by Jacob and William Grimm in the early 1800s. And before we get into the book itself, let's look at a little bit of history towards what a fairy tale is and towards the life of these two people. To begin with, a fairy tale, simply put, is a mythical tale or a tale about fairies, basically mythical creatures or fantastical beast or anything imaginary or anything magical that usually more often than not are tailored towards children. In a sense, fairy tales are children's stories about magic and some of that kind of stuff. And Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm are two people who made a collection of fairy tales and published them throughout the years, throughout their life. But they weren't always known for their publications of fairy tales. In fact, early on in their life, they were studying law, and they were pursuing careers in law and German history, as these guys were in German in the early 1800s. The thing was, however, early on into their lives, their father suddenly passed away. This left their family in financial ruin, not allowing them to basically afford everything that they would have needed. And the fact that they had a whole lot of siblings, as well as no one had a job in order to keep their family supported, they had to find a way to support them, which kind of halted their studies a bit. However, they were lucky enough to have support from their grandfather as well as their aunt, who provided them financial support in order to keep them alive, in order to allow them to live on in their houses, as well as allow the brothers to go to high school and then afterwards university. There, they met a professor who took note of them and helped one of the brothers to pursue his career in law as well as German history. However, the other brother stayed behind and gotten into literature, and once they were reunited, they started a career pursuing German literature. And after a while, they decided that they wanted to publish some of the folk tales, German folk tales, into publications in order to make money as well as in order to share them. As telling fairy tales were a dying trade at this point, being because of the rise of books as well as other written forms of storytelling, they wanted to gather, collect, as well as preserve different types of oral storytelling. And that's kind of what we're looking at now, the type of verbal storytelling of fairy tales which were composited and kept by the Grimm brothers. And the thing is, they published these stories over 7 different volumes. Basically, each volume they would add or subtract fairy tales to their book. They started with around 86 stories in their first volume and ended with around 210 different unique stories in their 7th volume. Now, these books didn't exactly receive their notoriety and receive the fame that they might have had now. The thing being that there were a lot of things that weren't appealing to the public in the books, in the fairy tales. And these kind of things included stuff like the fact that they were a little bit too gruesome, that they might not have been too suitable for children. So the brothers toned down stuff, kind of like the violence as well as the stuff that happened in the books. One of the notable changes is their amendment of a certain kind of character trope. For example, in stories such as Snow White as well as Hansel and Gretel, as you know, there is an evil stepmother. However, originally, instead of a stepmother, this was an evil mother. It is believed they changed this because they believed motherhood is sacred, but I couldn't find out if that was true, so that's what we'll be going with for now. Later on into their lives, they published a different version of the Grimm's fairy tales. Instead of having all 210 fairy tales in a massive book with footnotes and stuff, they once again toned down the violence, once again made it more child-friendly, and they published, instead of all 210, 50 of the most popular fairy tales in the book. And that is the collection that we have now. Not exactly, of course. The original collection was written in German, and it was called I can't read it, it's German. It was basically the small edition of the Grimm's fairy tales. These were selections of the best, and there was a few things that were changed in order to make it more appealing to children. Like I've mentioned, the violence as well as some of the themes were toned down, the language were changed into a form where children would find it easier to understand, and illustrations were added. And finally, with these books, they received some recognition. Of course, they have previously received recognition for Jacob's publication of German grammar in 1819, but this was the first time that the Grimm's fairy tales were finally given recognition in their publication. And it's strange to think about, because if you look at story culture today, if you look at the type of environment or the type of ecosystem that we have our stories in today, there is a lot of influence drawn from stories such as fairy tales and all these old folklores, and a lot of that can be traced back to these two guys here, Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm. Such classics such as Cinderella, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, Hansel and Gretel, these are all fairy tales that were collected and compiled by these two gentlemen. And seeing how much of an impact and influence that they have given off today, it's kind of difficult to imagine how basically under the radar these two flew back in the day. But since then, their books have just rose and rose in popularity, and now basically almost everyone knows about these two, almost anyone at least who dabbles in stories, at least in the English language. And of course, you have major corporations such as Disney adapting these stories into movies, into films, and all that kind of stuff, which allowed these stories to reach an even wider audience and allowing them to reach even more people. And of course, these adaptations toned down on a lot of the violence that was still left over, because in the end, even though they toned down a lot of things in the original, from the original stories, in the small edition, there were still some things that might not have been, suitable for children. An example of this, a quick example of this, would be one that many people have already heard. Basically, in the Cinderella movie from the Disney Channel, there was a scene where the stepsisters were trying on the shoes of Cinderella, the glass slippers. In the movie version, no repercussions happen. They couldn't fit in the slippers, and the movie just moves on. However, in the Grimm's version, in the version that was published in the book, instead of just having the scene move on and having the slipper being passed on from one sister to another, they had tried some rather gruesome techniques to try and fit into these glass slippers, such as cutting off toes as well as shaving off a bit of the heel. And it's these kind of stuff that might not be suitable for children or might not be enjoyable for children that were cut out in order to make it more appealing to the masses. However, I do feel like it is an important part of the story in the original. Now we'll be going for a short break in a bit, and when we come back, we'll finally get into the books and see some of the things about the books that make it, in my opinion, such a good read, at least for a certain type of people. So don't go anywhere, we'll be right back, and once again, we are storytelling on Afrik Best Radio.
Afrik Best Radio is online radio, is either pre-recorded MP3 files or live via a microphone broadcast that are streamed over the internet. With Afrik Best Radio, we are not limited to one geographic area or dependent upon syndication partners picking up your show in order for it to be heard. It can be heard all over the world, global. The best and easiest way to listen to Afrik Best Radio on your phone in your car is via the appropriate app, Afrik Best Radio, official apps. Our website at www.afrikbestradio.online. Our partners that offer apps include Afrik Best Radio on Pandora, Afrik Best Radio on last.fm, Afrik Best Radio on iHeartRadio, Afrik Best Radio on LiveX Live, Afrik Best Radio on TuneIn Radio, and many more. Just type Afrik Best Radio on any browser or search engine online. How do we promote your business? Afrik Best Radio advertising can help you to get so many listeners while they are busy in their daily work on can easily promote business or brand. They gives you voice to your brand others provide.
Thank you for sticking around, and the break is over. So welcome back to storytelling, and let's finally get into the Grimm's fairy tales. Now, this version of the Grimm's fairy tale, as I have mentioned before, is the short version, meaning that of all the 210 stories, they picked out 50 of the best stories to put in this book. These 50 include such classics such as, I've mentioned before, Cinderella, Rumpelstiltskin, Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, among others. And the thing with these fairy tales is that some of them are really short. Some of them last only a few pages, and some of them are quite long, up to 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 pages. No, these are, once again, stories for children, so they aren't extremely complex, and they aren't extremely complex or thought out. The characters, more often than not, are cliches, and they are basically simple characters that are understandable as soon as you see them. Nowadays, these kind of characters might be considered one-dimensional or not well written, but it is actually this kind of one-dimensional characters that don't have a whole lot of depth in them, at least in this version of the stories, that make them such a good story for, at least, for different kind of purposes. First of all, it does wonders for people who are trying to adapt these type of old fairy tales into a new narrative or a new type of story. Having these characters as blank slates and having the focal not be on the plot, but being on the different things that happen, the events that happen in these stories and how they flow to one another. And while I guess that is technically the plot, it's not in a type of focus that is unbreakable. This leaves a lot of room for people to be able to change, adapt, and rewrite the story into different types of narratives. And this is one of the reasons why the Grimm's fairy tales, this fairy tale collection, has gotten such notoriety and has become such a big influence in the recent years, or at least in the last 100 or so years, because of its ability to adapt and change. And another thing is that, honestly, these fairy tales are just a whole lot of fun. The plots don't always make sense, and sometimes things just seem to happen. But of course, these are vocal storytelling stories. Of course, these are stories that were told instead of written. These were passed down by different people over different generations, and some things might have been lost in translation as well, which does give a rise to plot holes and one-dimensional characters. But when you're reading the stories, when you're going into the stories and just enjoying yourself, you just see that it's just a whole lot of fun. Let me read you one of these stories. One of my favorite stories in the books, at least, in terms of just pure enjoyment. It's a story called Cat and Mouse Partnership. It's a story that lasts upwards of 5 pages, and that's around it. However, never mind, I'll just read it and I can tell you later. So, Cat and Mouse in Partnership. A certain cat had made the acquaintance of a mouse, and had so much to her about the great love and friendship she felt for her, that at length the mouse agreed that they should live and keep house together. "But we must make provisions for the winter, or else we shall suffer from hunger," said the cat, "and you, little mouse, cannot venture everywhere, or you will be caught in a trap some day." The good advice was followed, and a pot of fat was bought, but they did not know where to put it. At length, after much consideration, the cat said, "I know no place where it would be stored up than in a church, for no one dares take it away from there. We will set it beneath the altar, and not touch it until we are really in need of it." So the pot was placed in safety. But it was not long before the cat had a great yearning for it, and said to the mouse, "I want to tell you something, little mouse. My cousin has brought a little son into the world, and asked me to be godmother. He is white with brown spots, and I am to hold him over the font at the christening. Let me go out today, and you look after the house by yourself." "Yes, yes," Mouse answered. "By all means go, and if you get anything very good, think of me. I should like a drop of sweet white wine too." All this, however, was untrue. The cat had no cousin, and had not been asked to be godmother. She went straight to the church and stole to the pot of fat, began to lick at it, and licked the top of the fat. She then took a walk upon the roof of the town, looked out for opportunities, and then stretched herself in the sun and licked her lips. Whenever she thought of the pot of fat, and not until it was evening, did she return home. "Well, here you are again," said the mouse. "No doubt you've had a merry day." "All went off well," answered the cat. "What name did they give the child?" "Top Off," said the cat quite coolly. "Top Off," cried the mouse. "That's a very odd and uncommon name. It is, as usual. It is a usual one in your family?" "What does it signify?" said Cat. "It's no worse than Crumb Stealer, as your godchildren are called." Before long, the cat seized by another fit of longing. She said to the mouse, "You must do me a favor, and once more manage the house for a day alone. I am again asked to be godmother, and as the child has a white ring around his neck, I cannot refuse." The good mouse consented, but the cat crept behind the town walls to the church, and devoured half the pot of fat. "Nothing ever seems so good as what one keeps to oneself," said she, and was quite satisfied with her day's work. When she went home, the mouse inquired, "And what was this child christened?" "Half done," answered the cat. "Half done? What are you saying? I never heard the name in my life. I'll wager anything it's not in the calendar." The cat's mouth soon began to water for some more licking. "All good things go in threes," said she. "I am asked to stand godmother again. The child is quite black, only its white paws, but with that exception, it has not a single white hair on its whole body. This only happens once every few years. You will let me go, won't you?" "Top Off, Half Done," answered the mouse. "They are such odd names. They make me very thoughtful." "You sit at home," said the cat, "in your dark gray fur coat and long tail, and are filled with fancies. That's because you do not go out in the daytime. During the cat's absence, the mouse cleaned the house and put it in order, but the greedy cat entirely emptied the pot of fat. "When everything is eaten up, one has some peace," said she to herself, and well filled and fat, she did not return home till night. The mouse at once asked what name had been given to the third child. "It will not please you more than the others," said the cat. "He is called All Gone." "All Gone!" cried the mouse. "That is the most suspicious name of all. I have never seen it in print. All Gone? What can that mean?" And she shook her head, curled herself up, and lay down to sleep. From this time forth, no one invited the cat to be godmother. But when the winter had come, and there was no longer anything to be found outside, the mouse thought of the provisions and said, "Come, cat, we will go to our pot of fat which we have stored up for ourselves. We will enjoy that." "Yes," answered the cat, "you will enjoy it as much as you would enjoy sticking that dainty tongue of yours out the window." They set out on the way, but when they arrived, the pot of fat certainly was still in place, but it was empty. "Alas," said the mouse, "now I see what has happened. Now it has come to light. You are a true friend. You devoured all when you were standing godmother. First top off, then half done, then—" "Will you hold your tongue?" cried the cat. "One word more and I will eat you too." "All Gone" was already on the poor mouse's lips. Scarcely had she spoken it before the cat sprang on her, seized her, and swallowed her down. Verily, that is the way of the world. These are the kind of stories that are written in the Grimm's fairy tales. The reason this is one of my favorite stories is just, basically, it's my favorite because of the ending. You have this whole build-up of the mouse finding out about the fat, and you're expecting some type of punishment for the cat. But in the end, all that happened was that the cat seized the mouse and ate her whole. It's just a big what moment. It's just a big wondering what the heck happened. Why did it happen? Is there any purpose to it? But in the end, you can't enjoy the story, or at least you can't enjoy these stories if you think too much about them. So you just read them and you just let them sit and just enjoy them. These are stories meant for kids, and not to discredit kids in any way, but these are just stories that are meant to be enjoyed. Of course, there are some lessons in there, and of course, there's some things that could be thought over, but in the end, it's just enjoyable. Once again, we'll be having to take another short break, and when we come back, I'll talk more about the book. See you soon, and don't go anywhere.
Afrik Best Radio is online radio is either pre-recorded MP3 files or live via a microphone broadcast that are streamed over the internet. With Afrik Best Radio, we are not limited to one geographic area or dependent upon syndication partners picking up your show in order for it to be heard. It can be heard all over the world, global. The best and easiest way to listen to Afrik Best Radio on your phone in your car is via the appropriate app, Afrik Best Radio, official apps. Our website at www.afrikbestradio.online. Our partners that offer apps include Afrik Best Radio on Pandora, Afrik Best Radio on Last.fm, Afrik Best Radio on iHeartRadio, Afrik Best Radio on LiveX Live, Afrik Best Radio on TuneIn Radio, and many more. Just type Afrik Best Radio on any browser or search engine online. How do you...
In the world is right here, right now. Hear this.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third and final segment of today's program. To summarize what we've been through so far, we talked about fairy tales, what they were and why they were important, as well as the Grimm's fairy tale. Looked a bit at their lives and a bit at their stories. And once again, we've gone through one of the stories, the Cat and Mouse in Partnership, and understood that the tone of these stories are rather light, and they're just a good fun read in the end. So, with all that considered, who might find these books enjoyable? Well, there are a certain type of, or at least there are a few certain types of people who I would recommend these books to, or at least this Grimm's fairy tale book to. First of all, I'd like to address that in the end, this book isn't perfect, and in the end, it's not the best piece of literature ever written. Of course, there are times when character motivations are questionable, and there are times when the plot doesn't make sense. And there are also a few fairy tales in this book that draw similarly to each other, which makes sense because these are a collection of told stories, and it would make sense that sometimes told stories can branch off and evolve into different stories. I'll give you a quick example of this. One of the stories called The 12 Brothers, another story called Six Swans, are extremely similar at least in terms of the conflict and the solution to the conflict. In fact, they have basically the same type of story, give or take a few different type of story beats. But in the end, this isn't a problem for the kind of people who might enjoy this book. First of all, although this is a collection of fairy tales, I am not sure exactly if I would recommend these books to children under the age of, let's say, 7 or 8. Not because of any of the content in this book particularly, but because of the language that is used. Again, this book is trying to be as true as possible to the original Grimm's fairy tales, which means that the language is oldish. The original book, of course, is written in German, and this is just a translation, so some things might be lost in translation as well. But the main issue that might keep children away from this is the language. As you've seen when I read back there, some phrases don't exactly mean the same thing as they do now. More often than not, you would be able to just read over these phrases and get what happened from context and try to guess what the phrases mean. But it could cause confusion to some people due to words such as thy or thine, or these just type of old English words. But for kids from anywhere from 6 years old up who might be able to have a better reading comprehension, maybe not 6, maybe a little bit older, maybe from 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade up, they might be able to enjoy this. But the main people who I think might enjoy this are people who are interested in stories, and not in terms of just enjoying the stories, but interested in the conversation about stories, just in stories. The reason for this being that this book is an extremely valuable asset to people who are enjoying stories and who want to understand more about the way that stories evolved over time. These books were taken from oral storytelling, a form of storytelling that is not easy to come by in the present day because of all the books and because of all the movies and all these other mediums of storytelling. But of course, oral storytelling is an extremely old and extremely important way that stories were told. Having stories passed down by the campfire or at night from mother to children, and over the generations, having these stories change and shift, and having them finally be recorded in written form as they are now. Of course, some of these stories don't make sense because these stories have evolved over time and they've changed so much from what they might have been from the beginning to what they are now. Even after they're written down, with adaptations and rewrites, these stories are still changing. So to be able to have this snapshot of what stories were like 200 years ago, of what oral storytelling was like before we had a massive library of stories to draw reference from, before storytelling was refined and studied and perfected upon, before all the evolution that's happened for us to get stories like now, because we didn't have stories like now back then. It's just, not only is it an interesting read, but it's an important read to those who want to understand more about stories. Reading this gave me a lot of insight towards how stories were told in the past, and with that insight of how they were in the past, it also allows you to see how they might have come to be in the present. And that's why I think old stories, especially stories that are written down from spoken stories, are extremely important. And these Grimm's fairy tales are important not only for that, but for the massive influence that they have given towards Western and English stories as a whole. By understanding the source material and understanding how different things change from the source material to the adaptation, not only is one able to see how it changed, but you can also guess as to why it changed. You can guess as to why things were changed, what works, what doesn't. And more importantly than knowing a lot of stories, than knowing a lot of techniques, it's understanding the progression of stories, understanding how they might change over time, and how they might have shifted. What works, what doesn't, what stops working, what starts working again. If you're someone who enjoys writing, or if you're someone who just enjoys reading for the sake of reading and want to understand how stories evolved, I really recommend picking up this book, the snapshot in time of what stories were like. And in the end, that's who I believe these books are best for. But that is all we have for today. If there is anyone on the stream that has any questions, since we have a little bit of time left, you can post your questions and I will try to answer them. If not, we will be ending the program here. And I'm not sure. But anyway, while we're waiting for the possibility of some questions or the possibility of some comments, let's go through some of these stories. The first story in the list of stories is one called The Frog King. From the Grimm's version to the modern adaptation versions that can be found in different storybooks, not much changed about this. Basically, it is just a story about a prince who was turned to a frog and was shown kindness. Wait, that's not what it's about. Never mind about that. The first question has come in.
Is right here. Right.
If you were to recommend only one story from the book, what would it be? Well, there's a lot of different stories and there's a lot of different types of things I might recommend it for. Again, if someone were to ask what my favorite story was or what the most fun read was, I would just recommend the story I just read just now, Cat and Mouse in Partnership. If you were to ask me about a story that has changed immensely and you want to see the change of what happened from the original to the modern version, I might recommend something like Cinderella, or maybe something like Little Snow White, because these have major story elements changed from the original to the adaptations that you might be familiar with. If you're asking about just which is the best written, well, then I wouldn't exactly be sure. In my personal opinion, I enjoyed The Brementown Musicians. This story hasn't changed much from its original publication to the type of publications that you get now in short storybooks. The language, of course, has been changed slightly in order for a newer audience to understand. Other than that, though, the characters and story beats are still as crisp and as enjoyable as they were before. This story is a story about a donkey who is old and is about to be put down. So he runs away from home and goes to a town called Bremen to become a musician. That's how the story starts. From then on, you'll have to read it yourself to see how it happens, because I won't spoil anymore. These are just a few stories that I might recommend for different reasons. And if you want a story that's just pure fun and a good read and something fun to be able to tell to other people, I would recommend The Valiant Little Tailor. This is a story about a little tailor who... Well, you have to read it for yourself to understand what I mean, but this is a story about a little tailor who, through different tricks and different types of con deceptions, managed to get from being just a tailor to a king. It's one of those stories where you have a character that just goes through and does certain things, basically shows off how smart he is and show off how resourceful he is and climbs the social ladder. And to the Cambodian people who are listening to this, there are some stories like this too. Although I can't seem to get the names for now. In the end, these are some of the stories I would recommend. Again, for my favorite story, that would be Cat and Mouse in Partnership. For the most enjoyable story and the most fun read, I would recommend The Valiant Little Tailor. For a story to understand how things have changed from this publication to the more mainstream and the more recent publications, I would recommend Cinderella. And for the best written, or at least in my opinion, best written story, I would recommend The Bremen Town Musicians. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all the time we have for you today. Thank you for tuning in. We are Storytelling, sponsored by Afrik Best Radio, and we'll see you next week.
The best radio station in the world is right here, right now. The best radio station in the world
Best Radio is online radio is either pre-recorded MP3 files or live via a microphone broadcast that are streamed over the internet. With Afrik Best Radio, we are not limited to one geographic area or dependent upon syndication partners picking up your show in order for it to be heard. It can be heard all over the world, global. The best and easiest way to listen to Afrik Best Radio on your phone in your car is via the appropriate app, Afrik Best Radio, official apps. Our website at www.africbestradio.online. Our partners that offer apps include Afrik Best Radio on Pandora, Afrik Best Radio on Last.fm, Afrik Best Radio on iHeartRadio, Afrik Best Radio on LiveX Live, Afrik Best Radio on TuneIn Radio, and many more. Just type Afrik Best Radio on any browser or search engine online. How do we promote your business? Afrik Best Radio advertising can help you to get so many listeners while they are busy in their daily work on can easily promote business or brand. They gives you voice to your brand. Others provide readers and experience that can truly define your brand and business. Afrik Best Radio advertising is different. It gives your brand a voice and reminds listeners about your product or service. Those who hear your ad can build a mental image of your brand based on the message you deliver. Contact us today for more information. English 00855 81645 101. Khmer 00855-12-367-764, or visit our website at www.africbestradio.online.